Do me a favor, turn to Acts chapter 17 so I can make the best of our time. And this is what I want to do. I don't want to stand up here and just go on and on for that 40 minutes. I want to spend about 25, 30 minutes of it unpacking what I think we should discuss, and then I want to give the floor to you for questions. I remember sitting on several occasions, sitting where you are now, and when someone would come up and they would give us their ideas, when they were done, we had questions, and they would just say, "Thank you, good night," and they would drop the microphone and they would walk out like a stand-up comedian, and I don't want to do that. I want for you to ask the question that you may have, because your question will be contextually relevant as you apply the insight that we're going to cover today. And one of the things I want for you to be mindful of from this day forward is your context. Always be mindful of your context. Don't let anyone universalize a church idea. I want to say this authoritatively, and I think I can get some cosign here, I hope. But don't come here and think, okay, I'm going to basically replicate everything that every speaker said here. No, you can't do that blindly. You have to take it back to your context and then translate it to the circumstances that you will find when you get home. So be mindful of that as you're hearing this. And I want to participate in you being mindful of that by offering the opportunity for you to extend questions as you apply those to your specific context. Amen? All right, let's pray before we start. God, we bless you for this time. And I ask that you would move me out of your way. Let us have the conviction of your spirit and not be driven by our personal preferences, our biases, but let our surrender to our King be what defines this time. We bless you for all that you're about to do in and through every leader in this room. Make yourself known and famous among us. In the matchless name of your Son, Jesus the Christ, we pray. Amen. A few months ago, we sent a church planting resident who was serving in our church to California because he's considering planting in the Los Angeles area. And if you're familiar with the Los Angeles area, you know that saying you're planting in Los Angeles can mean 40 different things, because Los Angeles is a country within a state, within a country on a planet. So you have to decide what part of the LA metro area you're going to be planting in. So he was using language like planting in Long Beach, or he was going to plant in Compton, or then he had a conversation with someone that told him that he should consider planting in Orange County. And if you are familiar with Los Angeles, you know that Compton and Long Beach are extremely different from Orange County. So when he comes back and he sits down with the elders and he's unpacking for us some conversations that he has had regarding what he thinks God is leading him to do there, we started telling him that he needs to start the process of the boots on the ground consideration. We're actually going to send him back. But boots on the ground consideration on what it looks like for the gospel to come to bear on each of those different communities, because the expression of the gospel is not going to be, the need for the gospel is not going to be precisely the same in all of those different communities. It's not going to be the same. And here's where we have to go into a theological discussion regarding what we mean by gospel. Now, here's I think the biggest mistake we make when it comes to the discussion regarding church planting. I think that we have not given much attention to our ecclesiology, our doctrine of the church, and we've given even less attention to our missiology, what it looks like, our understanding or our biblical theological background for what it means to be on mission. But the bigger thing is we have a flawed, or I would argue, a truncated view of the gospel. We've truncated the gospel. When I sit down with someone, usually around church planting, here's how they simplify it. And I don't know if you've hung out with very many seminarians, especially those who just graduated. Here's the thing about those who just came out of seminary. They know everything. Everything. Why? Because they read it in a book. And because it was in a book, it must be true. They know everything. So when we have conversations with seminarians who are considering planting, one of the things that comes up is, what does it look like? That's why that's our question to them. What does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on the community that you're considering? As you're praying over where you're going to be, are you also asking, what does the gospel look like when it comes here to make things whole? And that question is confusing to them because here's their understanding of the gospel. Jesus died to save me from my sin. And in their image, Jesus' death and his resurrection, and hopefully his ascension in their minds, is going to result in them having this experience on golden streets and pearly gates, and they're going to experience the eternal bliss of the presence of God for the rest of eternity, for all of eternity. And they have this idea of the gospel being this thing that is uniquely linked, entirely linked to eternity. And my question for them is, how do you link the gospel to time? What are the implications of the gospel on time? Let me shatter some soteriology here for just a second. Jesus did not die merely so that you could experience eternal bliss. I need you to think in a much more comprehensive way. What does it look like for the gospel to be the means, the route by which the kingdom of God is made manifest? And if your limitations on the kingdom of God are, we're waiting for the kingdom to come, and we're in anticipation of that kingdom coming. We just have to survive the circumstances that we're in now, and you treat the world as though it's a sinking ship, and your mission is to save as many people on that ship before it goes down. I'm saying to you that you have a truncated view of the gospel. That is theological reductionism. By the way, let me say this for the record. I didn't expect amens, but I will not give them back. It's mine now. Yes, and I have expectations of you going forward, okay? Just for the record. You have shown me it can happen. We're going to keep it going. I want us to be careful that we're not guilty of reducing the accomplished work of our King, not merely on the cross, because I think that we stop at the cross and it's a mistake. He did not just die. In fact, everyone stops at the resurrection. And he did not just get up. He ascended. He is seated in heavenly places. He reigns present tense as king. We're not waiting on a king. We have, calm down, Brandon, calm down. Because I haven't even got to the good part yet. Let me pull this preach back. Hold on a second, okay? We're not waiting on a king. We have one. Now, I will concede that it's an already, not yet, understanding of the kingdom, and his kingdom has been inaugurated. He presently has his crown. It has not been consummated. We have not all been gathered into the same kingdom place. I can see that, but you're not waiting on a king. You have one. So every aspect of your missional life, including leadership in any role, planting, parachurch, whatever it is, your responsibility is to ask, what does it look like for Christ to reign as king here? Or what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear here? We have to get a comprehensive view of the gospel. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's pastoring a church in Texas, and it's Texas. So the church is about 7,000 people, okay? It's four campuses around the suburbs north of Dallas, and the church is about 10 years old. He planted the church about 10 years ago, and there are just under 6,000 people, 4 campuses. And his biggest complaint is, we can't get our people to be on mission. And I said, well, what gospel are you giving them? And he said, well, I would give them the whole gospel. Jesus died as the conqueror. He uses very theological language. He overcame, he conquered, he destroyed the complications and the consequences of sin. And I said, that's it? So all they're going to do is go out into a world and say to them, while you are enduring hell in time, endure it with a smile on your face, because one day a king's going to show up and deliver you from this. How about this? Why don't you tell them that he will one day deliver them from this, and he has their hand in it now? And lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. He's resident now. Stop saying to people, he died so you can go to heaven. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 says that the sacrificial work of Christ reconciled us to God. But verses 11 through 22 says that he died so that everything that is broken can be made whole. He died so that everything that is broken can be made whole. In other words, when you look at your neighborhood, if you look at my neighborhood in Northeast Denver and you see single-parent homes, our question as elders is, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on the single-parent families in this neighborhood? Our church meets in a school deliberately. It's not the most convenient thing. We have to have 4 setup and breakdown teams who are responsible for getting us ready to go each Sunday morning. But we stay there because that school is 752 students. And our question as elders is, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on the children and the families represented here in this school? In fact, the school we meet was the first school in the state of Colorado that was shut down due to underutilization and underperformance. They didn't have enough students there, and the students that they had there were not performing to an academic standard, so they closed the school. It's a middle school. Then about 3 blocks south of that middle school is Manual High School. The following year, they did the same thing at Manual High School. So they closed a very large middle school and the only high school in that part of the city, and the kids who lived in that part of the city had to be bused to other communities. And our question when we planted was, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on a community where the families don't trust the school district because you snatched their school away? You have to become a student of the place where you are. So I'm having this conversation with my friend in Texas, and he's saying to me, all you have to do, Brandon, is get a very good worship team together. We could have hired this crew right here to get us ready to go. And then have them lead us in worship, and then someone gets up, and he opens his Bible, and if he has the ability to say it, I mean, if he cannot just I'm not just referring to what he's saying is true. I'm talking about he delivers it in a compelling way. I don't see a whole lot of people here of ebony hue. So you're not catching what I'm saying right now. But there's a delivery. There's a way you say it. And we can know that it's time for us to get ready to go and become excited because you start to close, and we know the hum coming, and someone goes over to the B3 organ, someone who can do that well. Worship is tight and the message is good. Then people will come in droves. And I said they will come to what is essentially a pep rally. And then we're going to send them back out into a world who does not care about their pep rally, and they will have empty hands, unequipped to confront a community that's in desperate need of a specific application of the gospel in that community. Now, here's my reference point, Acts chapter 17. I'm in good company here. Acts chapter 17, and we're going to start New Bible, okay? We're going to start at verse 16. Luke is your author. He says, Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching of Jesus and the resurrection. They thought Jesus was one God and the resurrection was another. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what the new teaching is that you are presenting, for you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Now let's start from the top. We're going to finish the rest of the chapter, okay? It says in verse 16, "Now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him because he saw the city was full of idols." So we sent our resident to to California. He comes back and he says to us that he's thinking of 3 entirely unrelated communities there in LA. And we say, okay, we're going to wait a few months and teach you some more stuff because we may have dropped the ball here a bit, and then we're going to send you back. And we said, we don't want you to sit down with a whole bunch of people just yet because those bunch of people will have voices that sound too much like God and it will take you in all these different directions. Instead, we want you to do a tour of the city by yourself for just a moment and get a glimpse of the values that are there. Or using the language of Acts 17, what are the idols that are there? What are the things that are adored there? Some appropriately and some inappropriately. But if you are pastoring in a community and you do not know what the idols are, then you are ill-equipped to address the gospel needs of the people who attend the church, and you are ill-equipped to equip them to go out and address the needs of the people who live in that community. You need to know what the idols are. Now you're thinking, these idols are very explicit. They're altars, and they're obvious, and they have names, and people are bowing before them, bended knee worship. You have bended knee worship in your cities. And you are to discover what that bended knee worship is. I can always tell. Who's from Denver? I can always tell when the Broncos play a 1 o'clock game. Church is empty. Empty. When they are on the East Coast and they're playing an early game. Now, I want to say this to you for clarity. We start at 10. Okay? And while we have charismatic tendencies, we're charismatic with a seatbelt. We're out of there by 11:30. So everyone can be home in time for a 1 o'clock kickoff without a problem. No, because they have to prepare wings and these 7-day dip, and they have to get, first of all, they have to be rested so they can play the game with the team, I guess. I don't know. So if the game starts at 1, I can stand up on Sunday morning and I can say the game is at 1 o'clock, and all the ladies in the room will say, yes, yes. I can tell when we got snow in the mountains. I can tell because being in God's creation is much more important than being with the God of creation. You have bended knees in your city. I'm from Texas. People in Colorado think they love football. No. No, in Texas, it's a God with whom God competes. You need to be attentive. You need to know those things about your location. You're not merely here to exegete this passage. You're here to exegete the ears that will be hearing the passage. You are to be readers of the cultural context. If you do not do so, then you will be speaking a language other than the people in the room, and your words will be futile and land in empty places. Don't go through the process each week of preparing a message that no one will understand. They will hear you, but they will not understand or see the relevance of what you're saying because you're not speaking to the cultural context of the people in the room. When Paul was waiting for the meeting, he did a tour so he can know who he was about to engage. You can get a good read on who someone is, on the personality of a group, by getting a good understanding of their idols. So he does a tour. He notices the idols. Now, we're going to come back to that in a moment, but I want you to hang on to that for just a second. Then he goes on to say, then Luke goes on to say, so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons in the marketplace every day with those which happened to be there. You should know the cultural setters in your context. You should know who they are. You should know who your councilman is. Not for political reasons, but because they set culture. You should know who the mayor is. Please know who the mayor is, okay? But you should know who the influential leaders are. Not just elected officials, but who are the pastors, religious leaders, community leaders, civil rights activists, social justice warriors in your community? You should know who they are because they're setting culture. And you don't want to set culture so you can figure out who you're going to team up with, you need to know who's setting culture, because you need to know what you may need to correct. So you become a student of the people who set the cultural norms. As was his practice, when he gets to the city, he goes to the religious leaders there in the city. He's already familiar with the idols. He goes to the religious leaders, and he has a conversation. Pastor says he goes on and has a conversation with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. He's aware of the thinking, the thought leaders in this place. He knows who the thought leaders are. In 2021, that is both easier and harder. It's easier because everyone goes public with their ideas now. We're having conversations right now regarding social media, the implications of Instagram and Facebook. Everyone is a self-ordained thought leader. And sometimes they don't even care whether or not what they're posting requires much thought. I don't care what your eggs look like for breakfast. I don't need to see it. But everyone has gone public. So it's easier for you to find out who the thought leaders are, because you can track them as they've made themselves known. Publishing, self-publishing in that electronic format is much more common now. The thing that makes it harder is there are now so many voices that you have to now figure out who the actual influential voices are. I watched this past week. I don't get a chance to watch very much television, so I go straight from home to office, and then I make sure to leave everything that is work related at my office. So when I get home, I can be a husband, daddy. My daughter is the one who made me commit to doing that. She doesn't play, and when they go to bed, that's when I have my first opportunity to have like decompression time before I go to bed. And I will watch a documentary or something like that. And I watched in 2 consecutive days, I watched 2 documentaries of the Fire Festival. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Fire Festival that occurred in the Bahamas, both Netflix and Hulu have overlapping documentaries regarding what happened there. And the thing I found fascinating is that people who have no acquired qualifications, credentials, or track record of being influential are now influencers. So hundreds of young people spent thousands of dollars to get on a plane and go to another country to hear Blink 182 because one of the Jenners told them they should do it. That is something you are going to be battling. If the initiator of the thought didn't give it much thought, they went public with it, and then hundreds of people thought we should do that because she thinks we should do that. You're going to routinely encounter that type of thing. The thought leading aspect of this is much more complicated for you, because Paul could study Epicureanism and Stoicism before he had this conversation. You're dealing with a person who has genuinely given very little thought to the influence that they have, and you're having to engage the consequences, the implications of their influence. You have to be a student of that in your context. We'll get to implications of that in a moment. He studies the idols. He addresses the influencers, the thought leaders, the philosophers in the place. And then he receives an invitation, not just from the church to be the voice there, but he also receives an invitation from the city, the community leaders, and he accepts it. And he goes and he shares the gospel with them, and he shares it in the context that they understand. You're familiar with the chapter. He says, I noticed when I got here that you guys have many idols. I see you guys are prone to worshiping stuff. And there's one, because you want to be careful that you don't miss anyone, you have one altar to the unknown God, and he uses that opportunity to communicate to them who the God whom they claim to not know is. He inserts into that unknown position the knowable Yahweh, the knowable Christ, the actual King. He spoke the gospel to them in their terms. In fact, if you get to the end of this chapter, on 2 separate occasions, he quotes their poets to communicate to them. He used their language to communicate his message to them. He communicates his message to them in their terms, which you cannot do if you cloister in your study and know nothing about the cultural context where you are. You have to be a diligent student of the place to which God has called you. And then your question is, what would happen if the gospel comes to bear on this community that God has placed me in? Okay, now here's why you ask that question. I tell church planters that every church is in one of three seasons. For the rest of the church's existence, it's in one of three seasons. You are either planting, thriving, or replanting. And everyone attempts to live in the thriving season for the rest of their lives because we think replanting is a bad thing. No, replanting is what happens when the mission field changes right in front of you. And then you ask, what would happen if the gospel came to bear on this community? Well, since the community changed, the answer to the question regarding the gospel's implication may have changed as well. And that requires a moment of replanting. I'm not saying you turn the church on its head. It's revitalizing, it's breathing life, it's refocusing, it's an emphasis of the mission as God is clarifying it for you now. You should not say this is our vision and it has been our vision for the past 63 years and we're not changing it no matter what. You should look at the community and say, what should the vision be now? I have never met, the reason I'm here other than the opportunity to stand here before you is because Mark Halleck is here. I have never seen anyone take a church and say, this is what breathing life into a church looks like. He's like my hero. He's the only man who hugs me with both arms. He does that brilliantly. I want to be here to hear how he talks to you just because of how well he does that. You should look at the circumstances in front of you and say, does the church that I'm leading, does the mission that I'm leading need to adjust to the circumstances right in front of me? Because the place where you planted may no longer exist. When we planted the Embassy Church in 2011, we chose Northeast Denver because of its diversity. Diversity and integration is one of our distinctives. And we chose it because, at the time, the neighborhood was 33% black, 33% white, and 33% Latino. It's perfect. It was perfect. It was perfect. 3 years later, right in front of us, because of the gentrification, the whole neighborhood looked entirely different. A neighborhood that was 80% black just 60 years ago is now less than 20. That happened right in front of us. We saw it happen. One of the things that comes up is there is now an ethnic rift between the black people who remain and the incoming gentry. And because I'm a pastor, I'm the safe place to whom they can both speak. So the black people who live there, my next door neighbor said this to me. She said, this was a black neighborhood because they wouldn't let us live anywhere else. I don't know if you know how this works, but Denver had redlining. So black people, prior to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, could not qualify for a home loan anywhere outside of the marked off red lines, which is how 5 Points neighborhood in Denver became a black neighborhood. That's how that happened. Okay? We could not qualify for it. We had judicially sanctioned segregation in our housing that still exists right now. Still exists right now. And because of that, the black people in the Denver metro area, they all lived in Northeast Denver, 5 Points, Whittier, Cole, and North Park Hill. And now those neighborhoods the black community is the minority community. My next door neighbor says they would not let us live anywhere else, so we lived here. and we turned this into the place to be. And then they came and they took it from us. So she has animus toward the incoming community. The incoming community can't wait for her to leave because the gentrification is causing property value to go through the roof. I bought my house in 2014. My wife and I were renting it for 2.5, 3 years before we bought it, and then our landlord moved to Texas and sold us the house. I bought it in June of 2014. By May of 2015, it was worth $96,000 more than I paid for it. The property values are going through the roof because of the gentrification. So the gentry is excited about the exiting community because the more they exit, the more our property values go up. So you have one camp that hates you because you're coming in and taking something from us. You have another camp that is removed from you. They are aloof towards you. They can't wait for you to leave because their property values are a priority. And it results in what we call a Cold War. And it would be irresponsible for us as a church to say, we're going to plant a church here, and we're going to make sure the worship team is banging, and we're going to make sure the sermon is entertaining so that people come. And instead, we should ask, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on the implications that come from gentrification in our neighborhood? Stop making the message a 30,000-foot message. Bring it down to the ground because that's where all of your listeners are. What does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on the ethnic rift in our neighborhood? How can we as a church have an impact on the fact that 2 schools, the only 2 schools in the entire state to this day, were shut down in that neighborhood because of underperformance and underutilization? Now, there are practical expressions of that, and you have to be the student of how that works. So when we asked that question in our elders meeting, we said, well, the first thing we want to do is go to, for the school matter, we want to go to the principal and ask her, what do you need to keep this from happening again? And she said something to us that messed us up. She says the biggest problem we run into is the kids don't get their school supplies until 2, 3, 4 weeks into the school year, because their parents cannot afford the school supplies. In addition to that, we need classroom supplies. When I was a kid, my parents didn't buy classroom supplies. They would get a school supply list at the beginning of the school year. We would go to a local drugstore, we would buy everything on that list, and I was ready to go. These kids are not getting school supplies until they're a month in, and by that point, they're behind. And the teachers need things like dry erase markers and Kleenex and pencils. They're having to buy them themselves out of their lowly paid pockets. So we said to her, this is what we want to do. You make a list of what every grade level needs, and we're going to buy a backpack for every student in this school, and we're going to fill every backpack with the school supplies that each of them needs on the first day. So when they register, they get a backpack and the school supplies they need so they don't start behind. That conversation with her was the result of us asking, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear on this school? It has built a trust between her, the principal, and us. In 2019, on the second Monday of the school year, a 7th grader shot an 8th grader in the face. It was a really bad day. It's always a bad day for that to happen. I want to make that clear. But it was a really bad day for that to happen because they had just had their first fire drill. And after the shooting happened, the building had to go on lockdown, so people thought this is just an extension of the drill that we just did. So it created all kinds of confusion in the school. And as far as the teachers and students know, there's an active shooter in the building. I found out about it because 2 different news outlets called me for a comment. And I said, I can't comment on a shooting at the school because you're the reason I know it happened. I don't have anything I can tell you. So then I called one of my teammates, one of the other pastors, and said, there was a shooting at Cole. He calls the principal. She can't answer because the shooting as far as they're concerned, it's still active. So she and her staff are hiding in the bathroom of her office. When they finally unlocked, to remove the lockdown, she called him and she says, I need for you to be at the school first thing in the morning. We had no idea what she needed. We just wanted to be there for her because she requested the need. By the way, I want to make this very clear. This is not a Christian school. This is not a private school. This is a Denver public school. And the principal said, I need you here first thing tomorrow morning. So he and I, we meet up, we carpool to the school. We get there, and she says, this is what I need. She says, the school district is going to send crisis counselors to meet with every teacher. But they're sending only 2. And we have dozens of teachers here. And she says, I need for the teachers to be healthy so the students can be healthy. It's like the stewardess tells you on the plane, you put your mask on before you put your child's mask on. I need to check the well-being of the teachers before we get into the issue with the students. And she asked us, can you get a team of pastors together and meet with every teacher in the school today? A principal of a Denver public school, not even a Dallas public school, of a Denver public school, said, can you meet with every one of my teachers? And we misunderstood her, and we thought, okay, so we're going to meet with all of the teachers who come to see us. She said, every teacher is coming to see you. They didn't get a vote. I need you to check on every one of them to make sure that they're okay. And we said to her, okay, listen, we're not Freudian psychologists, we're pastors. So we will do it carefully, but when we sit down with them, we're going to seek their wellness, their wholeness, their well-being by communicating a gospel message to them. And she said, it's the reason I called you. Now, she did that because we were there for her when there was no grand emergency. We had years of built and nurtured trust with her. In fact, we were overwhelmed. We had to call some friends of ours and pastors in the neighborhood. We called 3 or 4 pastor friends of ours from other churches and said, we need you to get to Cole now because we had to meet with about 5 dozen teachers before 3:30 today, and one at a time. And teachers were coming into the room, and many of them did so reluctantly, but when they walked in, they would break out in tears as they discussed it. One woman was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, and she was mourning because she thought that not only was she going to lose her own baby, but her kids were going to die because as far as they knew, there was an active shooter in the school. And we had the opportunity to share the gospel with her. That opportunity was availed to us only because we routinely ask, what does it look like for the gospel to come to bear in this community? And that school is the thing that God constantly brings up. So to think in these 30,000-foot terms, where you're saying, I'm going to get in a room and preach John 3:16 to everyone who comes, instead of asking for the implications of the gospel on this community, is a disservice to your responsibility as pastoral missionaries. Now, here's the thing that all of you are going to hear me say. I live in a neighborhood where such things happen, and therefore the need to do that is greater. No, go to southern suburban cities, and you're going to run into children who are well off, and they're having an Oxycontin addiction, or they're cutting themselves. Don't decide that no one needs the gospel here. Don't decide. You do not have the right to determine who the recipient of the gospel is. You are to preach a comprehensive, contextualized gospel message, and you are to do so indiscriminately. But you cannot do so effectually unless you become a student of the people that God has called you to. You are to not just exegete the passage, you are to exegete the community. We are in is this technically Denver? Are we, okay, it is. Okay. Pastor Mark, you're in Inglewood. Okay. I'm in unconfused, unambiguous Denver. Okay. Our church is 5 minutes northeast, if that, of downtown. You know you're in Denver because trains are going by, okay? Even within this Denver metro area, the community that Pastor Mark engages is not a replica of the one I'm engaging. So he has to be a student of where he is, not just the church, but the place where the church is, so that he can be an effective pastoral missionary in that community. You all have that responsibility. Every one of you has that responsibility. Take the message from 30,000 feet and put it on the ground, because that's where everyone is. Questions? Well, I think he beat you to it. Yes, sir. Yeah. So much of your work is not determining who you pay attention to. Most of your work is going to be who you can contextually disqualify. Sometimes, and by the way, I don't get into pointing out the specific person. I don't say in front of the church, say, stay away from this person. I think that's counterproductive. I've always had a problem with moving someone away from something versus pointing them towards something. So you're familiarizing yourself with these ideas, not so you can disqualify them or write them off or figure out who you should listen to. You're familiarizing yourself with them so you can juxtapose them against a gospel kingdom message. And I assure you, let's start with this presupposition, every message that's not the gospel is inferior to the gospel. You're going to walk into that juxtaposition with that mindset in place. And then you're going to point out how this thing is, in what ways are these things inferior? In what ways are they inferior? So you can point out how the kingdom of God addresses something that this worldview falls short on. That's more your agenda. You're not becoming, we want to be careful that you don't become, oh, here we go, I got it. If you go to D.C. and you go to the Secret Service office, there's a vault in the Secret Service office, and in that vault they have every single successful counterfeit bill that was ever printed since just after the Civil War. Every one of them. And they don't study them to be familiar with that fake thing. Instead, they study the real thing so they can easily identify the fake thing. I don't want your eyes to be fixed on the fake thing. I want your eyes to be fixed on the real thing. You familiarize yourself with the fake thing only so you can juxtapose it against the real thing. You don't have time to shoot down every bad idea. But there will be times when a bad idea elevates to the point of such cultural significance that you have to address it. And you have to be to familiarize yourself with it so you can show how the gospel is superior to it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you're talking about how you're in a neighborhood that's 30% black.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So I'm in a neighborhood down similar. There's different worlds, but they're smashed together.
Mm-hmm.
So where is it that you're looking for the points of conflict? Because the gospel is a message of reconciliation, and that's where you're going, or how do you pick what you're learning?
Right. It's not always points of conflict. It could be points of identity. And so you have to figure out what is it, how do I present a message that presents a bridge between these two legitimate identities? So in our neighborhood, we have difficulty appealing to the Latino community, not because they're Spanish speaking, but because we are not Catholic. It's not because they're presently plugged into a Catholic church. It's that if they did go to a church, the church would have to be Catholic. So we had to figure out, how do we address that aspect of their identity? You are studying them not so you can figure out what you're combating. You're studying them so you can figure out what you're ministering to. I want to avoid the language of being combative. Yes. Yeah, you do have to be multiple persons. You have to be. Okay. You are about to put me up on my soapbox now. Okay. The church is called to be multicultural and multi-ethnic. It's called to that. That's what eternity is going to look like. So let's just go ahead and start now. Okay? Might as well go ahead. If you are looking forward to white or black church, I tell people this on a regular basis, you're going to be grossly disappointed in eternity. So you might as well get yourself there now. And one thing I have to remind people of is the church is called to see more cultures than their own. In fact, a local church is called to see cultures that are not even represented in that church. So when I tell the body of believers that they are called to be a church that values multiculturalism, and they say to me, this happens all the time, but Brandon, I pastor a church in, oh, wait a minute, I have people from different states. I can't clown other places. Okay, give me grace here. But I'm from a person who says I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay. All right, and they'll say, Brandon, there are no black people in Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay, that's exaggerated, but it's a truism. Okay, so, and they'll say to me, how do we get black people in our church? I said, you have to make distinctions here. So I want to point something out to you. There's a difference between race and ethnicity, and we make the mistake of treating them as synonymous. One race, human, comprised of many ethnicities, and those many ethnicities are comprised of even more cultures. Okay? So I have my friends who are continental Africans, when people will see us on seminary campus together, they're like, these two people are just alike because they both look the same. No, he's from Nigeria, and I'm from Texas, a whole different country all to itself. We're nothing alike. Okay? We have the same ethnic background loosely because of some stuff that happened with some ships from Africa to America. But we have no cultural overlap. And I'm saying to you, you are responsible for being a student of those diverse ethnic groups and the cultural backgrounds. And whenever someone says to me, that's hard, I say to them, black people have to do that all the time. I graduated from a seminary that I adore. I'm on the board of that school right now. When I was a student there were 33 black students. Not 33%. 33. I knew every black student in that school when I was a student there. Every one of them. And you know what every one of them had to do? They had to go to class and learn theology in a predominantly white context and then figure out how they're going to translate this to their non-white context. Black people have to do that all the time. You can do it. I have a friend in California who says, you can't get a GED without knowing white and European history. You can't get a GED without it. But you can get a PhD without knowing anything about black history. And I'm telling you, that's not cool. You are ministering to everyone in that neighborhood. I see your question back here. I'm going to give you a second. When we got ready to plant our church, a missiologist looked at our church planting proposal. And he saw diversity and integration was in our proposal. And he says, you should take that out. You should take that out of there. He said, Brandon, you should just plant a black church. I said, well, no. But I said, and I did ask him, why would you tell me that? He says, because you're black. And he says, you probably preach the way black people preach, so black people will be drawn to you. So that's who you should target. And I said to him, they're not targets. They're image bearers. And my neighborhood is gentrifying like mad. So you're telling me to go through my heavily gentrifying neighborhood and say, to just walk down the street and say, okay, yes, yes, no, no, not them. They look kind of, I don't know where they're from. Yes, no. That's not how this works. We preach a gospel that makes things whole. How dare you apply the whole-making gospel in such a broken way? So you have to become a student of a plurality of cultures, and it can sometimes feel daunting, but the entire time you're enduring that. Remember the day I told you this. I am bicultural. When I'm hanging out with my friends in Dallas, the culture with which I identify, the people with whom I grew up, it's not the same language and behavioral norms that I exemplified when I was in class on campus. And it's code switching that everyone endures unless both places where you live according to the same cultural code. If we can do it, you can do it. Yes, sir. Right. Define apologetics. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that the outcome of apologetics is to present an affirmation of God's existence and accessibility. The point of apologetics is to present an evidence of God's existence and accessibility. Here's the problem with apologetics as we use the term. We always approach it as the academic thing that proves that God exists. So we're coming to people with the cosmological argument for the existence of God. We're coming to them with the teleological argument for God's existence. Here's evidence, here's philosophical evidence that God exists. The people in my neighborhood don't need the cosmological argument. They need a glimpse into what it looks like for a human being to look like God. And seeing human beings look like God proves to them that God exists. So I'm not going to sit down with a mother who can't buy school supplies for her kids and say, okay, according to William Lane Craig, here's how you can know God exists. I'm going to say to them, the God whom I serve has prompted me to let you sleep tonight without trying to figure out how you're going to buy school supplies for your baby. And when I walk away from her, she's that much closer to an understanding of who God is. That may not be the deciding factor. That may be the seed. But I think that sometimes we're so focused on the verbal arguments that make the point that we miss that the lifestyle is essential to undergird the argument that we're making. You have to present the life that convinces. And that's one of the things. I'm making an argument by buying the school supplies. I make an argument by meeting with the teacher. And when they walk out of there, I am not ashamed to have communicated the gospel to them. Unashamed. And I'm saying to them, you have experienced deliverance and wholeness and well-being now because God had you covered, had your back in the midst of that horrible moment. That's the first thing I want to point out. The second thing is, man, it fell out of my head because that apologize thing is so important to me. So I forgot what my second point was, but I hope I answered your question. I think that if someone, I went to school to study apologetics. And when I got there, I was there to figure out what all of the apologists say. And at the time, I think there was some legitimacy to that. I still do. I have not changed on that at all. But I think that the apologetic question has gone from, how do I know God exists, to what difference does it make that God exists? I think that's an apologetic question. I think we made the mistake of separating apologetics from evangelism. And I believe that apologetics and evangelism coexist. Apologetics is a handmaiden of evangelism. So I want my evangelistic life to be an evidence of God's nature, his evidence, and his relevance to their lives. Oh, I remember my other point. Now, when I was talking about the broader thing is, as pastors, you need to be familiar with key thought leaders who young people are encountering. So if you have not read, let me think of an example that may be foreign to. Oh, if you have not read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, play catch up. A book called Between the World and Me. It was banned in a few different places. But thank you, sir. You want to familiarize yourself with that because millennials and Generation Y are appealing to that as a background for much of their social justice ideas. And not only do you familiarize yourself because you want to be able to have an intelligent conversation with them, but you want to also be able to use similar language and see where they're coming from when you're engaging them on that. This one may get me in trouble, but my car is really close. Okay? I have yet to meet a person who came to me and said, critical race theory is evil. And then upon saying that to me, when I leaned in and asked, what is critical race theory, they had an answer for me. It has not happened yet. Now, I know some of you are like, I know what it is. I'll get you when you're done. We'll see. Because I have yet to have someone shoot that out of the sky. And this is not a cosign. I'm just letting you know that when you shoot something down, you need to know what you're shooting down. Yes, sir. Yeah, I think everyone heard that question. I would argue that your responsibility is to preach a kingdom-minded theology of social justice. And be honest when it overlaps with the genuine observations of people who don't have that kingdom in mind. Be honest. Listen to me. I believe that systemic racism exists. When I get pulled over, I did not come here to talk about this. Y'all did this, okay? When I get pulled over, I do not have the same reaction as many of the people in this room. My hands are at 10 and 2 the whole time. I have everything ready to go before he gets to the car door. I turn the light on in my car so that he can see everything that is happening. I genuinely believe it. And whenever I sit down with my friends who tell me that there's no such thing as an ethnic caste system or that that systemic racism exists, I remind them that the same Jonathan Edwards that we had to read in seminary argued for an ethnic caste system. It's how he justified his ownership of slaves. By the way, Jonathan Edwards owned slaves. He purchased them as children because they would live longer, which made them a better investment. And I was the guy wearing a Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy t-shirt, not knowing, because no one had brought this up, that the man I'm revering was a slave owner. George Whitefield was not only a slave owner, but he was an anti-abolitionist. He changed his mind. He was opposed to slavery until he figured out it was going to be financially lucrative for him and his orphanage. He changed his mind. And the theology that they use to justify it is theology that we're still teaching now. Jonathan Edwards' anthropology, which was his justification for slavery, we still teach it. And we think you can teach the anthropology without some of those byproducts, without some of those symptoms, and I'm telling you, you can't. You have to honestly assess the theology that we're teaching so you can read the world from someone else's perspective. In addition to that, sometimes another person can see something that you can't see. Experience helps form lenses so that you can see things. And if you haven't had the experience, you may not be able to see the thing. My wife drives a Chrysler Town and Country. And when we got married, she made me promise her, before we got married, she said, I never want to drive a minivan. I promised her. It was almost in our wedding vows. Okay? No minivan. Okay? And then we had kids, and kids come with stuff. Car seats and strollers and diaper bags and Skittles. We don't even buy Skittles, but somehow they're in the car, okay? And I said to her gently, I think it's time for us to trade in this midsize sedan and get a minivan. And she said, no, you promised me. So this is what I did. We had a trip to Dallas for Christmas. I rented a Chrysler Town and Country. I drove first. When we got to Oklahoma, I gave her the reins. 2 hours later, she says, I think I can do this. Okay? We get back to Texas. We get back to Denver, and 2 weeks later, we bought a Chrysler Town and Country. As we're coming out of the parking lot, in our brand new Chrysler Town and Country, a Chrysler Town and Country drove right by us. And before we got home, we saw 5 more. We'd never seen them before. We had never seen them, okay? Now, one of two things is true. We're the Kardashians, and word got out that we bought this minivan, so a whole bunch of people bought the minivan because we bought one. Or that van was always there. In fact, the Dodge Caravan / Chrysler Town and Country is the most sold minivan ever. We just didn't notice them. Until we had a Chrysler Town and Country experience, we did not have the lenses to see them. Are you tracking with that? When you routinely experience injustice, you will then have lenses that sees legitimate displays of injustice. So be careful when you write someone off by saying, I don't see what you see, because it could be that their experiences gave them lenses to see something that you can't see. So you bring a gospel, kingdom-minded view of justice, and then you have to honestly admit when a non-believer is making an observation that aligns with the same gospel message that we're preaching regarding justice. That's my consistent response to that. Yes, sir. Okay. Oh, okay, okay.
So, for me, to look at what the kingdom of God looks like, for me, I looked at that and said, and I'm asking for your understanding of what I'm saying.
Uh-huh.
Three things, whatever. I look at the socioeconomic aspect of that.
Uh-huh.
Say the gospel looks like someone who is at the bottom can come in and experience the love of Christ and can be whole through all of us loving and serving God together.
Okay.
So how does what you're saying relate to that sort of thing? Am I trying to think bigger than that?
Oh, I'm pretty impressed by that. Okay, that's pretty impressive. I will say this, though, because we got to stop. But I want to point something out. Earlier we mentioned race, ethnicity, and culture. You will never hear me obligate a church to be multiracial. You'll never hear me use that language. You will hear me obligate a church to be multicultural. Because it is possible to be multicultural without being multiracial. And it is possible to be multiracial and those races still be only one culture. And I would also argue that if you're multicultural, the diversity of the diversity of ethnicities will take care of itself. But it's possible for you to be multi-ethnic and dishonor the diversity of culture. So it's possible for you to value the cultures of people who are not resident in your church. So if they should, even if there are no black people there, you should, I have to carefully use the word should here because I don't want to get an email. But be mindful of cultures other than your own. during worship. I think the easiest thing we can do is diversify our worship cultural norms. And as a pastor, you are shooting for the growth of the people in the room, which means sometimes exposing them to things that they are not exposing themselves to. So the people in your church should know who Israel Houghton is. He's black, y'all. He's black. Okay, but worship styles and cultures outside of their own. Even if there are no people who look like him in the congregation, the cultural diversity is something you want to bring to them. And there are passages that absolutely lend themselves to that. I also want to point out that your responsibility is not just cultural diversity, but socioeconomic diversity is a priority. I cannot get around Matthew 25, because Jesus says, when you fed the hungry, that was me. When you visited the imprisoned, that was me. When you care for the marginalized, good looking out, I needed that. Okay? And he says, and I will divide sheep versus goat based on how well we do that. That convicts me. It terrifies me. Are we on mission to the point where we're mindful of the marginalized people whom Christ identified with in Matthew 25? That's a consistent check from me. One last question. Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. Yes, I should have just given you the mic. That was a message all by itself. I think sometimes we often think of these divides as ethnic divides, but I don't think the church has called us to simple diversity. I think he's called us to unity and not uniformity. And so it doesn't look the same everywhere. So if I go to a city, if I go to Atlanta, if I go to Detroit or Memphis, and everyone who comes is African American, then the question we should be asking is, how diverse of a people does this African American group represent? Are they from different socioeconomic groups, different education levels, different generations? We went through that season a few years ago where if your church did not appeal to men, there was something wrong with you. And for decades, for millennia before that, your church had to appeal to women. And you do know that Jesus wants both men and women in the church. He's a fan of both. Okay, so you should be asking yourself: is this a church for men, or is this a church for the people whom we are engaging? Is this a church for women? Or is this a church for the people who live on this mission field that God's called us to? It's possible for you to seek out the group you're engaging, and they may look the same from a distance, and they're nothing alike. Be mindful of that. That was an excellent point.